No. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your time and efforts and consideration in being part of something that may be a little sensitive to the subject matter. Today, we're going to be talking about sexual violence and substance use disorder. And this is by prevention educator Rick Del Pino, myself. So I always start with saying, who am I? Because I want to let everyone know where I'm coming from and where this information will be coming from. Hello, I'm Ruth Del Pino. I'm a prevention educator. I'm the Mercer County grant coordinator for the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, leadership skills training, or life skills training and leadership. So those are my credentials. I always also start with why this presentation, because I really want everyone to know where I'm coming from, but also where this information will be coming from as well. So first off, this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. And on top of that, this may not even be a parenting class in its own right, because this is talking about how adults can interact with youth and children and give them the best experience possible to make sure that they themselves are growing in a thriving environment. This is also my perspective, and my perspective is shaped by my learning experiences. Anything that I come across as a prevention educator, any studies, any webinars, any sorts of coalition meetings, all of those pieces of information will be brought back to my presentations, because those are important things. They are evidence-based, they are empirical-based, and these are the sorts of pieces of information we look towards when we are interacting with youth, especially to make sure that we're giving them the best fighting chance. This is also a presentation that is evidence-informed and some evidence-based, meaning evidence-informed, I look at information, I bring it back to the presentation, and I give the resources so that you all can look through it with me as we go through this. If this is the video on YouTube, then you can look through it with me, and you can go back and see the resources as they come through. This is also evidence-based in that I pull from the empirical evidence-based programs that I do as a prevention educator. So I do also have disclaimers, because I think, one, it's important to have disclaimers for something like this, but also to sort of set some ground rules in case there's any questions or concerns or any baseline interactions that may want to happen during this time. One, there is no debate on whether or not sexual violence exists. It does, and that is the fact that we are going to have. Two, if you have a hard time getting through this presentation, you can do what you need to do, whether or not it's leave, mute yourself, put something in the chat. We're not going to go into detail, but I do have some trigger warnings before some information is presented, because it can be sensitive. Another is experiences vary, and they are all valid, meaning sexual violence exists on a spectrum. It exists in different forms, and it exists in different power dynamics. So one is not inherently worse or better than the other, and we are going to honor that as well. And this can be a hard reality for many people, and I will do my best to respect those experiences. This is specifically about adolescents for adults. So meaning I don't have a lot of information on adults and sexual violence, because that is a separate presentation. That is a separate field of expertise. We are talking about how experiences in childhood can affect substance use disorders and vice versa. And also, substance use disorders look different in everyone. Once again, substance use disorders are not the same as addiction. Addiction is the last step of a substance use disorder, which is in its own right somewhat encouraging, but because it lets us know that there are different points of intervention when it comes to substance use disorder. So at any stage, at any given point, can someone reach out for help, even if they are addicted and dependent on a substance? Also, last but not least, resources are available. You and your loved ones are not alone when it comes to something like this, especially when it comes to something like this. And those resources will also be at the end of the presentation as well. And if you are concerned about anything in particular, you can reach out to me specifically through my email on the Mercer Council page. So excuse me, we are going to be talking about why is it so prevalent, and we're going to sort of be talking about the presentation order. So why is it so prevalent? Because there are many different angles when it comes to sexual violence and its interaction with substance use disorder. But I'm going to be talking about two angles that are sort of blanketed experiences. The first one is instances in which substances are present, and the second would be substance use disorders that may result from sexual violence. So instances in which substances are present, meaning drug facilitated sexual assaults, or alcohol especially is definitely one of them, and substance use disorders being a coping skill as a result of sexual violence that may have occurred with a person or a perpetrator. So those are the sorts of this is the order in which we are talking about here. So drug facilitated sexual assaults. What does this mean? It sort of is in the name, really. And what we sort of are going to be talking about right now is some of this content may be triggering. It does talk about experiences that people are drugged and then sexually assaulted, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about them, because these are things that are important to talk about. But drug facilitated sexual assault is the action in which someone drugs another person, usually to make them weaker and more compliant in a power dynamic. So if it is someone that may be uncertain of their physical capabilities of overpowering somebody else, they may use a drug to weaken that other person so that they can do what they want with them, if you will. And this is sort of some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this video. But before we do that, actually, I think we're going to be doing the video first. But after we do that, I'm going to look at some publications with a government resource that sort of talks about some of the drugs that may be interacted with when it comes to these drug facilitated sexual assaults.
Emergency room visits in recent years.
This is coming in the wake of sexual assault allegations rising both nationally and locally. Our Aaron Rogers is joining us now live here at 7 on Main in the studio with a lot more on the hope that victim advocates say they have in the middle of all this trauma. Aaron.
Well, Amy, the Julie Valentine Center says a good number of the calls they got this week had to do with sexual assault from drugging or alcohol. Even earlier this week, a prominent Greenville developer, Marcus McCall, was arrested for allegedly drugging and raping a woman.
When it comes to sexual assault,
we're not shocked.
At the Julie Valentine Center, they see it every day. But this week has been different, even for them.
It is shocking to have 7 emergencies in a 24-hour period of time.
Center advocates have made trips to the emergency room where they provide support for sexual assault victims for 4 children and 3 adults.
3 were drug and alcohol facilitated sexual assaults of females.
They say that number doesn't include the alleged victim of Marcus McCall, who claims the developer also drugged and raped her last month.
Most times when someone is raped or assaulted, it's committed by someone that's known, loved, and trusted by that person, and very likely the community.
With McCall, deputies say the victim knew him.
About a month or so prior to the alleged incident taking place.
The director of the Julie Valentine Center says around 80% of the sexual assaults they see happen by drugs and alcohol.
We mean someone has intentionally given someone an excess amount of alcohol and drugs and has taken advantage of them while they were in an incapacitated state.
And that could prolong victims coming forward even more.
There's just this inherent fear that you're not going to be believed. Add to that if you have been drugged and were assaulted and you really can't remember what happened to you.
Advocates say they want the recent attention given to sexual assault claims to change attitudes.
I really, really believe and hope that this is where we shift the focus from blaming victims and shift the focus to blaming offenders.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk about that newsreel really quickly, because one, it is important to know that there are places and people that are looking for this information, and they are collecting this information. It is not something that is not being addressed, but also the number in itself was a little bit concerning. So if we're talking about a lot of these things that are coming through, or a lot of these people that are being perpetrated against, they had stated out of statistics that said 80% of the sexual assaults that come through are drug facilitated in some capacity. Now, what does this mean? This doesn't necessarily mean that this person was completely incapacitated and they were drugged, but it does mean that alcohol played a role in the way that consent and the way that the power dynamic shifted. So we're going to be looking at this PDF very quickly. It is a PDF that sort of talks about some of the drugs that may be present or put in alcohol specifically so that it interacts with the body. GHB is a very common one. It's a Schedule I drug. And those of you that don't know Schedule I drugs, Schedule I drugs are classified as any drug that does not hold a medicinal purpose in any capacity. So this holds alongside something such as marijuana is a Schedule I drug, heroin, meth, cocaine, those sorts of things that don't serve a purpose other than recreational abilities and something that alters brain activity. So this can also be found in a lot of systems, ketamine, ropanol, they have a lot of street names for these things, but essentially almost all of them in their own right sort of are conglomerated to mean roofie. And roofie meaning that it is an inhibiting drug that causes a lot of side effects. So this is a great resource to know just because of the amounts of questions and answers people have about drug-facilitated sexual assault. And there have been a lot of links between drug-facilitated sexual assault and substance use disorder. So if you want to look at that on your own free time, the link will be in the description below. So as we're sort of talking about this as well, we want to sort of know what the side effects would be for a drug-facilitated sexual assault, so that if anybody comes to you, if any youth comes to you and says, I don't know exactly what happened, here are my side effects, things like that, these are some things to look out for. Difficulty breathing, feeling more drunk than the alcohol that they had consumed. So for example, children obviously shouldn't be drinking alcohol, but if they do, especially if it's a teenager, they may have had one beer, but they would know maybe what their body interacts with that beer, and they feel more drunk than if they had just that one beer. Loss of bowel or bladder control, so people that may have done anything that they can't control their bowels for. Nausea, sudden body temperature changes signaling a spike in sweating or chattering teeth. So whether or not it's like really cold or really hot, that just shows that your body is overreacting with a substance. Sudden increase in dizziness or a disorientation and blurred vision. This can mean that this person is staggering, and if this person is staggering, to make sure that they are getting the help that they need. Waking up with no memory or missing large parts of their memory, but knowing that something happened, and that can be a really hard feeling to come to terms with, but it is something that needs to be addressed as well. So when we are sort of talking about drug-facilitated sexual assaults, a lot of people ask, and a lot of people do ask me especially, what types of settings is this usually conducive to? When does drug-facilitated sexual assault actually happen? This can mean a lot of different things. So when they say drug-facilitated, it just means that drugs are present somewhere in the sexual assault. It doesn't necessarily mean it's just alcohol. It doesn't necessarily mean it's just a roofie. It can be a combination of a lot of different things. But in any capacity, it is meant to incapacitate people who are being perpetrated against, whatever that looks like. So that is what the drug facilitated part comes in. All right, so we're going to be moving on to the next thing. Once again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We can talk through them a little bit as we move forward through this presentation. So I would be remiss if I talked about sexual assault and substance use disorders without talking about the sociological aspects of this. So culture and the way that culture exists is extremely important for us to understand, so that we can sort of fight a lot of these pervasive and very present sentiments in society. So there is something called rape culture, and I do want to preface with saying gender does not negate experience. Boys and girls both experience sexual violence in varying capacities. What can be and is concerning is that most of the perpetrators happen to be male or men in general, so that once a society socializes men specifically to have a certain type of mentality, then we are looking at something much more dangerous. So especially the way that women and men are socialized, this can be extremely important to know. And women and men in the binary sense, obviously there are genders in between that exist, and that is a very interesting and hard conversation to have as well. And if you're wondering about any of those gender differences, I have another presentation called LGBTQIA+ youth and their interaction with substance use disorders. So that can be referred to while we're going through this as well. So rape culture is the environment in which rape and sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and in everyday life and popular culture. Rape culture is perpetuated through the misogynistic language and the objectification usually of women's bodies and the glamorization of sexual violence against women and weaker populations. So rape culture can sort of exist on a spectrum, obviously, much like anything else. Boys will be boys, blank asked for it. There are a lot of times in which there are people that say, oh, it's not that bad. 1 in 12 instead of 1 in 6 women are sexually assaulted. Inflating statistics, possibly to minimize what people are going through. And to say it's not much of a problem can seriously be concerning because of the reality that it doesn't matter whether or not it's 1 in 12, 1 in 100. There are still things happening to women and men and weaker and considered weaker populations or disenfranchised populations because of the sentiments of rape culture. And that number, whether it is smaller or larger in the grand scheme of things, it still happens and it is still pervasive in our culture. Policing clothes and how to wear them, especially on girls in school, not taking reporting seriously. So if one of your friends comes up to you and says, I think something may have happened last night, knowing what to do is also a really important part of that. And if a youth especially comes up to an adult and says, someone hurt me, having those conversations can be really difficult, but that is a huge mitigating risk factor to make sure that people get the help they need in order to work on what may have happened to them. And assuming it's always weak people who are perpetrated. And I think this is something that may be hard for a lot of people to understand, because you can say, I'm 6'8", I'm a hulking, I'm a hulking person, I have a lot of muscle, I can fight off anyone. It doesn't really matter when drugs are involved, especially because anything that can compromise your vision, your ability to interact with your environment, those are all things that seriously need to be addressed, because whether or not you think that it may not happen to you, then it can still happen to someone else that may look like you. And that is something that's really important to know. I have a graph here that talks about rape culture, just so we understand sort of what this looks like. This ranges from a lot of different things, whether or not it's locker room talk, sexist attitudes, unequal pay, unsolicited pictures that are sent to a lot of different types of people, especially on dating apps, groping, condom removal during sex, sexual coercion, safe words that are violated. And then it goes into a lot more serious offenses such as molestation, murder, gang rape, and violence, such as those sort of things. So it is an escalation, and that doesn't mean that if someone says girls should stay home, they're going to perpetrate another person, they're going to hurt another person, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. That definitely means it's still a reality that can happen. And that those sentiments, if they are reaffirmed over and over again, and the normalization of the sentiment happens, then that means they are given permission to go to the next stage and push the boundaries of that rape culture experience and of that rape culture sentiment and discourse surrounding that. And also, rape culture is something that happens on a large scale, but it's also very individual. Whether or not you're having a conversation with someone and they say boys will be boys, or they're saying something about a joke about sexual assault, these are the sorts of things that need to be mitigated, but also intervened. So the fact is that if we are giving permission to people to have these sentiments, then they may not necessarily know what's wrong. They may be socialized in a different way than other people. So they may not necessarily know what it is they're doing wrong or how they're feeling about it. So this is something that if it's on the lower spectrum, we can definitely give people time to adjust to a new way of thinking. But the more it goes up, the harder it can be for people to understand how to intervene and mitigate a lot of those actions and sentiments. So I sort of want to talk about this as well. This may be a hard reality to come to. And a lot of people say, well, what's the point in being so paranoid? What's the difference between paranoia and caution? And paranoia and caution kind of go hand in hand when it comes to mitigating sexual assault, especially drug-facilitated sexual assault. So there may be some paranoia because there's always somebody who knows somebody that has a story. There's always somebody who knows somebody that may have experienced something very harsh and terrible. And there's a lot of different stuff to it, where people carry pepper spray, where people carry keys in between their fingers when they're going to their car. These are the sorts of things that women especially deal with. This doesn't mean exclusively, but especially women deal with on an everyday basis. So other drugs, especially when they're being used, it can be of concern. So a lot of the time when people say drug facilitated sexual assault doesn't really happen that often, or it doesn't happen as often as people say it does, that may be true. And there are statistics show that it is much more rare than maybe other offenses, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. And toxicology reports don't always look for things that may affect or compromise a victim's or survivor's perception. So especially when it comes to other drugs being used. So here I have Benadryl and Visine. So what in their own right do they have to do with anything in particular? Well, I think that what we need to know is that Visine and Benadryl are things that make people that compromise people's abilities. Oh yeah, I see something in the chat. The keyhole, yeah, it's very natural. And yes, Visine does cause a lot of different things, but especially because Visine can lead to death and poisoning if it is used too much. So essentially, Visine is a very regulated substance, and it has an active ingredient in it that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. But essentially what it does is it produces vomit, and it induces vomit and diarrhea and nausea, and I believe just a lot of lethargic feeling, especially when you have it intertwined with another substance, especially when someone takes out an eye drop, puts it in an alcohol bottle, and then puts it back in their pocket. That can be something really concerning to witness, but also to sort of see. And Benadryl in itself makes people very sleepy, especially when it interacts with different drugs. So what a lot of the time people may not understand or may not realize is that toxicology reports may look for things that are saying, oh, if maybe there was a Schedule 1 drug involved, maybe their blood alcohol content was over the limit of what it needed to be in order for this person to say yes. Those are all the sorts of things that exist, right? That's the sentiment. But the reality is that there are very common household things that can exist in everyday life for people to use. And especially if this information is more common, this information is more shared on social media and through word of mouth, this can be really concerning. So especially when someone wants to know what happened, asking to be tested for the active ingredient in Visine and the active ingredients in Benadryl may change the story and how the perpetrator may be caught. So this is another useful piece of information that is the harm reduction piece to make sure that everyone knows how to interact with these sorts of things. A lot of people say you can never be too careful. It won't happen to me. Just know that you can be too careful in terms of, living in paranoia can be really anxiety inducing. It can be really hard to do. It can be really hard to live in that experience, but also knowing that safeguards can exist. Having a safe word with your friends if you're out at a party, knowing people who are willing to work with you in case you are feeling anxious, knowing the exits in a building, like all these sorts of things are things that people have to think about, but also can be mitigating factors in something that could be much worse. And also saying that it won't happen to me. That's a reality that's just not something that anyone wants to come to terms with, but it can happen to anyone. And I think that is where the paranoia comes in, saying it can happen to anyone, it may happen to me. But knowing that you are safe with your friends, that you are doing what you need to do, that you are that we are looking at our behaviors, we can only mitigate so much, but also knowing that if we talk and intervene with people who may have the rape culture sentiment or may have some of those rape culture initiatives inside of them that need to be addressed and worked through, then we can also work on it that way. So there are a lot of different ways to stop sexual assaults, but also to make sure that it never happens in the first place. So I do I'm going to be talking about childhood experiences, and this will be just a quick thing. I did want to talk about a study that I had found that I'm going to link in the description below. And what they talked about is the relationship between sexual and physical abuse and substance abuse disorders and consequences. So what they talked about, and the numbers are actually not that varying when it comes to experiencing sexual assault and abuse in general as children. Excuse me. But they interviewed about 670 men and women. And what they had found is for men, especially if they had experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse, especially if they were children, it indicated whether or not they would have substance use disorders later on in life. So they were much more likely to have a substance use disorder later on. And with women, they actually found that discrepancy didn't exist at all. And I sort of looked at it and I didn't understand exactly why. But the reality is that sexual assaults and sorts of forms of abuse happen much more often throughout a woman's life, just in general. So if it happens to them in childhood, they will have a risk factor for substance use disorder. But in the same conversation and discourse, if it happens to them later on in life, they still have a likelihood of having substance use disorder. So it really doesn't matter whether or not it happens throughout a woman's life because of the amount of perpetration that happens throughout women's lifetimes. But for men, especially because they end up being considered, like when they're children, there may be a lot more power dynamic relationships that need to be looked through, that they are more likely to be okay later on when they're older, because of their physical form and the way that men are socialized. That doesn't mean that there are not outliers. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen to men at all, but these are just some interesting statistics to look through. And boys are also more likely to be perpetrated against as children versus perpetrated against as men or adults. But here's some comforting information that I found that I did want to share, because these numbers can be a little bit grim. Their investigations have looked retrospectively at histories of interpersonal violence. And what they had found is that regardless of whether or not the age of intervention and the histories of interpersonal violence, whether it was physical, sexual, emotional, in general, it did not correlate with worse treatment outcomes, meaning that regardless of the age in which the intervention happened, regardless of whether or not there was sexual abuse only, whether or not there was physical abuse only, whether or not there was a combination of, they found that there was no effect on the way that women and men were rehabilitated for their substance use disorders, and whether or not they would have a substance use disorder at all. So that is good information to know, that regardless of what happens to a person, they're still able to mitigate a lot of those risk factors and get the help that they need. And I'm going to be talking about ACEs, because ACEs is an extremely important part of understanding the way sexual assault works as a child. I did do a whole presentation on ACEs, and it's called Talking to Your Kids Before It Matters. And I really touch upon a lot of the different things there. But this is actually a slide that I took from another presentation for that video, because I think it's so important to address. Now, when it comes to ACEs, ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the way that this was actually founded about was through sexual assault. And so there was a doctor, especially, that was at an obesity clinic. And a lot of these patients, he had found a good portion of them, about 50%, were not going through their daily routines, and they were not actually losing the weight that he had set out. And he was thinking about it, and he said, it's not as if they're not following the diet correctly. Maybe there are certain things that are happening here. Maybe they're not reporting their eating habits correctly, all of those sorts of things. And he actually took a step back and he decided to look through their emotional history, because he had found that a lot of them were actually emotionally eating. And he didn't understand why, he didn't understand how they would be able to cope with these sorts of things. And he said, you know, you have obesity. Wouldn't you want to help yourself to mitigate a lot of the physical health factors that happen later on in life? And what he had found is that of those people that weren't losing weight, around 50% of them were not succeeding in their weight loss plans. And he had found that the large majority of them had a history of sexual violence in some capacity. And this was something that really let him know that adverse childhood experiences, that the experiences that happen when you're young, really affect the way that you interact with your environment later on. And there is a great book called The Body Keeps Score. I'm going to just click on it so you know what it looks like. There's an audiobook. Oh, it's no longer available on Audible, but it is still available on different applications. But it is still called The Body Keeps Score. And it is a very good book to read, to understand the way that people interact with their environments, especially when they're going through things. So I guess the point is that ACEs in themselves are not excuses for people's behavior, but it is to understand why people may interact with their environment in the way that they do, why they may look a certain way, why they may interact with the world a certain way. These are all things that can be and are extremely important for people to address, especially when it comes to sexual assault, because it is something that does remain with people for a very long time after. But this also does show that children are resilient, that children have a lot of things that they can go through, but they are able to mitigate those risk factors if we have the right prevention, if we have the right intervention. And even though their body does remember, that doesn't mean that we can't help them. That doesn't mean that they are a lost cause. That doesn't mean that they will grow up and have a substance use disorder later on in life, or they will have a hard life later on. It just means that if we understand what's happening to them now, then we can possibly stop a substance use disorder from happening later on in life. And this sort of is through the points of intervention when you have a child come up to you, when they have small things that happen. And this really helps build the trust. This helps build the rapport that when small things happen, especially small troubles at school, they may have worries about friendship with their friends. They may have homework that they're stressed about. These are all things that need to be taken seriously, that need to be taken with engagement, that need to be taken with a decent conversation, with connection and understanding, for children to have that trust and rapport, that just in case something ever happens to them, they know who to go to in case something is wrong. And there is bigger stuff that they can come to you for if that smaller stuff is the foundation. So they may have stuff such as self-identity problems, self-identity in the reality that maybe they don't know exactly who they are. That's important for children to explore and important for them to have conversations about. Also trauma, especially sexual assault, especially abuse in the home, things like that, neglect, all of those things are things that help to identify, for us to understand that if they are having trouble, then we can intervene in those capacities. And just in general, life experiences that may be hard to talk about, that may be difficult to understand, death in the family, things like that. These are all hard realities. But if they're there for this, we are here for the small stuff, then they will come to us for the bigger stuff. And I think that is a good way for us to help intervene in these experiences, and especially in these adverse childhood experiences. So I will be talking about some of the resilience that we can foster in children. And this is actually a YouTube video that I found that I absolutely adore. This person, his name is Hank Green. And he is someone who is a scientist. He does a lot of research on brains and just in general, neuroscience. And I think that it is really important for us to understand that trauma and addiction does have a correlation. But he sort of does talk about the science behind it for us to really give language to some of the hard vocabulary that we can talk to children about. And also, I did want to talk about a lot of people. I did have a couple of people ask, like, why April? I mean, why this presentation in April? Well, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, among other things. But this was a time for me to sort of shine through on some of the really important aspects of April. So also to understand that Hank also talks about preventable action and mitigation, and we will be talking about that once the video is over. So excuse me for a second, I have to find the place. Okay.
While others seem able to move on.
Oh, okay. Give me 1 second, my apologies.
All right, so why we're even being many emotionally traumatized combat soldiers. So do a lot of other drone operators. But why do some victims of trauma suffer from PTSD while others seem able to move on? Well, it's psychology, so the risk factors are complicated. Some findings suggest that there may be genetic predispositions making some people more vulnerable than others. We also know that context and environment matter. For instance, someone who has experienced childhood abuse might feel, on the one hand, more ready to deal with difficult and traumatic experiences, but on the other hand, they might be more likely to default to the suppression and avoidance in which PTSD sufferers frequently engage, which, as we've discussed in previous episodes, often makes psychiatric symptoms worsen over time. As far as what's going on in the brain, PTSD shares some similarities with anxiety disorders. For example, the brain's limbic system may flood the body with waves of stress hormones like cortisol every time images of the traumatic event bubble up uninvited into consciousness. And we've already talked a lot about how the amygdala and hippocampus are involved in those classic fight or flight reactions, which, when prolonged, can be really rough on the body. In fact, neuroimaging suggests that trauma, or the chemical processes set into motion by trauma, might actually damage and shrink the hippocampus. Since this region is also associated with how we consolidate memories, this might explain how memories associated with trauma could fail to be filed away as long-term memories and instead remain vivid and fresh through flashbacks and nightmares. If there's any silver lining to all of this, it's that some people may actually experience positive change after a trauma. Treatment and social support help some sufferers achieve post-traumatic growth, positive psychological changes resulting from the struggle with challenging circumstances and life crises. That's in part what Tolkien did. Though he suffered great trauma and loss on the battlefield, he was eventually able to use those experiences to drive those powerful allegorical stories that help not just himself, but many readers of all ages around the world. It seems that while whatever doesn't kill you might not necessarily make you stronger, sometimes it really does. But suffering can also feed on itself. Many victims of trauma try to cope through what's colloquially called self-medicating, and some can end up with substance abuse or dependence issues. Psychologists define addiction or dependence as compulsive, excessive, and difficult to control substance use, or other initially pleasurable behavior that begins to interfere with ordinary life, work, health, or relationships. This could mean over-consuming drugs or alcohol, or compulsively gambling, eating, shopping, exercising, or having sex. People with addiction may not even realize that they've lost control of their behavior for some time. Addiction can refer to a physical dependence, a physiological need for a drug that reveals itself through terrible withdrawal symptoms if the use stops or reduces, or psychological dependence, the need to use that drug or complete that activity in order to relieve negative emotions. People with addiction are sometimes stigmatized as pleasure-bound hedonists who have no self-control, but people often compulsively use substances or do things in reaction to stress and other psychological problems. For various reasons, they've been prevented from coping in other ways, or maybe they just never learned how. So in this way, addiction itself is often secondary to the more complicated matter of how a person deals with stress and difficult emotions, or what kind of stressful situations they've survived. Few will dispute that much of what makes addiction possible is chemistry, but people are different from their life experiences to their biological sensitivities, so people respond in different ways to different drugs and behaviors. Many people can drink casually or gamble once in a while without losing control. Others simply can't. And people in recovery from addiction may also have different needs. Some will need to be completely sober and never again touch that drug or do that thing, while others may in time be able to regain enough control to use again in moderation. Likewise, some folks can kick the habit on their own, while others do better with or need support from professionals or support groups. Researchers in groups like Alcoholics Anonymous debate whether addiction is a mental illness, like a software problem related to thoughts and behaviors and feelings, or a physical disease, a hardware problem related to biology and genetics, or both, and even whether addiction and dependence are the same thing. Either way, it can be hard to recover from an addiction if you don't get the underlying problem treated. But some people believe that you can't treat the underlying problem without first getting the addiction out of the way. While this controversy too continues, many are moving toward a model of treating both at the same time, the so-called dual diagnosis model of treatment. Addiction that's rooted in deeper psychological issues, especially in emotional trauma like PTSD, often requires some version of dual treatment to untangle both issues. The good news is, while PTSD and substance dependence may be distressing and complex, people can begin to heal given the chance and the resources. We're amazingly resilient creatures. When nurtured with the proper support and practice, we can overcome a lot. Today, we talked about the causes and symptoms.
I just love the fast talking Hank Green, where he sort of talks about a lot of different things very quickly, but does it in a way and presents it in a way that's sensitive and knowing who his audience is and talking about it. I adore a lot of his scientific research and a lot of what he talks about. But really what he does talk about, and what I sort of want to reiterate also, is that when people go through sexual assault, when people have a lot of substance use disorder present around them or experiencing it themselves, that doesn't mean it's the end all be all, and that a lot of people can find help, can recover from it, can move on and learn how to live with their experiences. He did allude to something that I did want to touch upon very quickly. Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien is the author of the Lord of the Rings saga. And what he sort of did is Tolkien decided to take a lot of his experiences on the battlefield in World War II and put them into writing for Lord of the Rings. And what he had done was found a creative outlet in order for him to express what he was feeling, but also to put words in a way that sort of give him control over his trauma and over his experiences on the battlefield. And a lot of people can do that. They can take their experiences, put them into different places and use it to help others. And that is a way in which a lot of people decide to do it. And that builds on resilience, that builds on mitigating factors, that builds on intervention and talk therapy and different forms of intervention in general. So that we also can understand that even if we think, oh no, this person can be broken or this person is not going to recover from something so horrific, that doesn't mean that they won't. I think that a lot of the time when children especially are given the hope to move forward and given the resources, they can have a very fulfilling life. And J.R.R. Tolkien is just one of those people. And I really like the Lord of the Rings franchise, in case anybody was wondering. So a lot of the questions that I will get are, how can we help? How can we mitigate these processes? How can we understand what's going through a lot of the people's mental states and things like that? One, understand who historically has been affected by sexual violence and substance use disorders, as well as mitigating rape culture. Prevention education on consent and coping skills is also very important. So especially in my life skills training, we talk a lot about coping with anxiety, coping with anger, those sorts of things. And these are skills that are given to youth for them to understand how to interact with their environments, how to mitigate their trauma responses, and to hopefully understand how to do better when it comes to interacting with something that may trigger them. I do have specifically womenspace.org for Mercer County specifically, but there are plenty of resources at the end of this presentation for people to sift through. Also, working through trauma and knowing your triggers so you can help somebody else may also be important, because something such as sexual assault or any substance use disorders or any sort of trauma responses is not necessarily something that doesn't happen all the time. It's something that happens very often. It's something that happens in places and in people that we may never have suspected. So to understand that if we are to work through our trauma to help somebody else, then that would be giving that youth a fighting chance as well. Also, Melissa Arnold is here. She does something called TIPS training, and she trains bartenders and staff of different establishments that serve alcohol to sort of look at the different ways we can mitigate underage drinking. But they do touch upon very quickly about, that alcohol can be a way and an environment for non-consensual actions to happen and to help mitigate a lot of those actions. And it is something that I think could be very helpful for people to understand, especially alcohol serving establishments to look at and hopefully intervene. Early intervention methods, I have alluded to them before, but early intervention methods can include anything from a sport, anything from a good coach that helps a person, builds their inner wealth, whether it's prevention education, whether it's art, whether it's therapy, whether it's talk therapy, whether it's art therapy. There are so many different ways that early intervention methods help people understand how to cope with such a traumatic experience. Also, I think that this is something that I talked about before, and I have talked about quite a few times, giving children and students anatomically correct nouns and verbiage to understand exactly what happened to them, to understand what their body parts are. Because if we sort of gloss over what different parts of the body means, then this person may be saying something that really matters, but a lot of teachers and prevention educators may be listening, or adults may be listening, that are saying, why are they saying that word? I mean, are they saying what I think they're saying? It cuts out the uncertainty of what a child may be saying to somebody else, especially because it really helps with children understanding what is wrong, what is right, and whether or not someone should be, doing something to them or not. And obviously, giving those correct nouns and verbiage to a child gives them a lot more to process, but also a lot more to understand their own bodies. Treatment and talk therapy are offered in many different forms, whether it's group therapy. I know a lot of people that heal through community service. Doing something for others may actually help them process through a lot of different things. And also taking experiences and divulgence seriously. So if a youth does come to an adult and they come to you specifically, knowing the resources of the area, knowing who to talk to, knowing that if you are the person that they are coming to and you don't know anything about it, knowing that there are other people available too. So even if you're not the right adult, they decided to come to you, meaning that even if you don't know how to respond, even if you don't know exactly the right resources, talking to someone who does, doing that research and helping that youth through the process, especially if they trusted you, is a really important part of their development, because they feel safe with you because they said something to you. So even if you're not able to be the person reporting, maybe sitting beside them, holding their hand, or comforting them in some capacity to make sure to let them know that they're not alone in this process can be a very comforting feeling, and also help mitigate a lot of those trauma responses. So I have one last thing, and I always end on a quote, and this one I have here. And it says, "And here you are living despite it all." And what we can close on is saying that a lot of the time when trauma responses happen, a lot of the time when adverse childhood experiences come in, we realize that we are very resilient, that even though we are resilient, our body does remember, but we can mitigate those trauma responses and give children the ability to flourish in their later lives because we have given them the resources now instead of later on. And knowing that at any given point, at any given time, whether someone is 80 years old, 8 years old, 18, it doesn't matter, in the reality that as long as people are getting help, they have the chance to live a very fulfilling life. So thank you for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts and your responses, but also knowing that this is a hard subject, but it's not something without giving gravity to it. And we should respect a lot of those experiences, and making sure that we give language to people who may not feel like they're brave enough to say something. So next week, we'll be talking about autism and substance use disorders. So I look forward to your time and your efforts and your experiences. And thank you. Oh, and Melissa, would you like to say something?
Yes, anyone who's interested, I have something that kind of goes along. It looks like a regular scrunchie. But when you take it out, it is called a nightcap. So you put it over, you can put it over your drink. Here's my Sam Adams cup, and it's got a hole on top where you can just put your straw. But unfortunately, these are great things for students to have, just because sometimes people slip things into someone's drink. So it's just an extra protection. If you want one, you're welcome to send Ruth your email and I'll try to put one in the mail for you. I don't have very many, but if you know someone who might be able to benefit from this, just let me know. And thanks for being here. And obviously we want to keep everyone protected.
Well, thank you, Melissa. And I have one of those, and they're very fun I mean, it also just protects your drink in general. So even if you leave it for a second and you don't want, like flies or anything coming into your drink, it's also just useful for that purpose as well. Next week, we'll be talking about autism and substance use disorders. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts, and I hope to see you next week.